Okay, so Brent Swallow here again, AREC 173, week of October 5th to 9th, second mini lecture on this introductory set of slides on agriculture environment interactions. And I hope that you've been able to sneak away and watch at least parts of the Rockstrom lectures as well as the Jonathan Foley lecture. When I show those in class, sometimes students by the end will say, we're all going to die. So the Rockstrom is, he's pretty positive, right? He thinks that there are things that we can do, but we're going to have to really be serious. We're going to have to commit ourselves, and we need to make change at higher rates than we've been making them in the past. So I'm going to go back into this again. Share my slides. So this is where I ended off the last mini lecture. So the next one is about kind of visualizing the impacts of agriculture. And I wanted to start off with this slide. So this is an actual landscape. And I visited this landscape. I didn't fly around in a drone as the people where this photograph was taken from. This is the landscape of the Honghe Hani rice terraces, which are in southern China and sort of southwest China. I visited them a few years ago on a trip organized by Biodiversity International, on whose board I was sitting at the time, and really such an amazing human endeavor to build these terraces, these rice terraces on the steep hillsides of this mountain range, and really starting from 1,200 years ago. So such a long history in this part of China of really looking after the environment, transforming the environment in remarkable ways, but doing it in a way that actually is relatively sustainable and is gorgeous. This particular group now, the people who operate these rice terraces now make their money from three or four things. They make money from tourism, or people call them agro-tourism, of primarily Chinese people coming and kind of walking through the terraces and admiring the ingenuity and the construction of this system. They also make money from rice, so they grow rice in the terraces, which is too much of a surprise. They also raise ducks, and sell both ducks and duck eggs, and that you can order over the internet these duck eggs to be delivered around Asia at least, and around China. They raise fish also in the terraces at certain times, seasons of the year. So this is a multi-attribute system which has been established. It's now recognized as a globally important agricultural heritage system, but you can see how much people can change the planet and actually can do it and this is a relatively sustainable system compared to many others. Okay, so just kind of starting off and sort of, wow, look what positive way that we can kind of manage our resource base. I want to talk about water, and as we saw in the planetary boundary discussion that in the last lecture, we still have a lot of more water we can use for human use on the planet. It is important to know that agriculture, especially irrigated agriculture, is the major use of water in the world. 70% of the world's fresh water that is used for agriculture. That's high. Most of that is agriculture is the biggest user of water, especially in South Asia. So places like Pakistan and India, which are beset by quite dry rainfall, but have the Himalayas as a major kind of watershed, providing water to them. It's pretty low in Canada. So only 12% of our water use in Canada is for agriculture. The rest that we're using is for industry and urban uses and domestic uses. Irrigated agriculture is important. It occupies about 20% of the cultivated area of the planet. So we're much, much lower than that in Canada and the US, but at the global scale, it's about 20% of irrigated area, cultivated area is irrigated, and that produces about 40% of the world's food. So, highly disproportionate yield per hectare in the irrigated areas compared to non-irrigated areas. We have systems like we see in southern Alberta. So southern Alberta is Canada's main location for irrigation and has been for the last about 100 to 120 years, from about 1900 when that area was settled and irrigation started quite early. And that is capturing flows of water which come from the major rivers emanating in the Rocky Mountains, especially the South Saskatchewan River system. We also have water which is used for irrigation, which is pumped from underground water or called groundwater or aquifers. And that is shown here in the bottom left-hand corner, is groundwater pumping into irrigation in the Punjab area of India, which is seen as one of the kind of rice bowls for India, a major rice exporting area for providing rice to the rest of India. And that is a system which we know far less of. We have far less useful data about groundwater. Mostly it's monitoring particular wells to see whether groundwater levels are rising or lowering, and both can be a problem, and we're going to see that in a minute. Here's the Hani rice paddies, and I showed you that slide from them in a minute. So here's a farmer harvesting fish from the rice paddy at about the time that he's transplanted the rice from a nursery into the field. So this is another irrigation system. Another way that agriculture is affecting water is affecting water quality. So this is primarily a pretty negative story. Here's an extreme example also from Hunan province, which is in the same province as the Hani rice plateaus, is this Dayanchi Lake, a photograph from The Guardian, showing huge algal growth on this lake next to this city. And that is coming from a runoff from agriculture, especially phosphorus and nitrogen from rice fields. China tends to have overuse of fertilizer, which is much different from the case, say, in Africa. Overuse of fertilizer, partly because of subsidies that are given. And a lot of that runs off and then runs into these water bodies, making them more productive in terms of plant growth. So algae, for example, is a plant which responds very well to these higher levels of nitrogen, phosphorus. All this stuff growing can deteriorate the quality of the water for other uses, and also make it less hospitable environment for things like fish. So you might get kind of die off of fish as you get this kind of murky kind of growth of all this plant material due to nutrient runoff into this. And that's a process called eutrophication. There's also, at another scale, the way that we do agriculture can affect the erosion from fields. So the detachment of soil from fields, that soil then moves down slope as water carries it down into rivers. That makes murky rivers that you could call are more turbid, so difficult to see through, changes the ecology of that. And ultimately this runs off into oceans and seas. So this is a river, the Changjiang River running past Shanghai, one of the biggest cities in the world. So therefore deteriorating the quality of the water in that environment near Shanghai. So a major effect on the people there, as well as that plume of sediment extends well out into the oceans there and affects ocean ecology. Okay, so we've got kind of water quantity use in agriculture, the water quality effects of agriculture. Now I want to think about greenhouse gas emissions. So this is a little bit of review of what we've dealt with in the previous section, but there are these major sources of greenhouse gases. One is methane. Two ways that agriculture produces methane, or NH4, is through the ruminant digestive system that cattle, sheep, and goats all share, and llamas and alpacas all share, which is a major source of greenhouse gases itself. There's also methane emissions from anything which grows or spends a large period of its life submerged in water, which we call anaerobic growth, right? It's not growing in oxygen. The oxygen is kind of cut off because it's growing underwater. But that also creates the conditions for the nitrogen cycle to release methane as well. So there's methane emission associated with paddy rice. So scientists are trying to find ways of growing rice without it submerging to have less methane emissions. So can you grow more rain-fed rice, at least, or irrigate in a way that doesn't lead it flooded? So this is a main challenge for the rice agronomists of the world. Overall, and the bottom corner here, I've got an interesting innovation from South India, which kind of pulls together the water story of agriculture with the climate story. Their groundwater pumping often has been done with diesel-powered engines with subsidized diesel prices in India. So farmers get diesel at low prices. They then pump that, and so that's a major greenhouse gas emission itself, is the use of that pumps. A possibility is to replace the pump with solar power, and cut that off. And so that has a major innovation, which is sort of changing the main concern we have about diesel-powered engine and irrigation, is this potential for solar irrigation. So the big picture story is that agriculture, forestry, and other types of land use contribute about a quarter. So here the estimate from 2019 from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is that the AFALU, agriculture, forestry, and other land uses, is responsible for about 23% of all greenhouse gases associated with people. So we call that anthropogenic. So what do people do that are greenhouse gas to emit greenhouse gases? Because that's what we have control over, right? Agriculture contribute about 13% of the carbon dioxide. There's other big emission sources for carbon dioxide. About 44% of the methane. So these two sources of rice paddies and livestock. Sorry, whoops, got ahead of myself. And about 82% of the nitrous dioxide emissions, which come from the way that we produce fertilizer, that we draw nitrogen from the atmosphere, convert it into nitrous dioxide, and then use it to fertilize our crops. So that's a major way that we as people are contributing to greenhouse gases through agriculture. And of that, so part of that is if we think about a area of land used for agriculture, how much is it contributing to greenhouse gases? But also because we're growing the area under agriculture, we're growing it into other land systems like rangelands and grasslands and forests. How much are the emissions associated with expanding our footprint of agriculture? And the estimate is it's about half-half. So we could say if in a place like Canada, we're not expanding that much into new land. It's the other half of our emissions that we have. Places like Brazil, most of the of the emissions are associated with expanding the area that they're using, where they're cultivating agriculture. So if we can intensify our land use and stay with the current land use, then we can cut out about half of our emissions, but still we've got those emissions to do with that half. And we're going to get into this again with deforestation in Brazil story next week. Okay, so we've sort of dealt with greenhouse gas emissions, water quantity, water quality. Now deforestation is this big force which is related, as I kind of related to that climate story again. And these things are all interrelated. So think about deforestation. There's kind of frightening numbers about the rate of deforestation. And this is all, say, between 2002 and 2019. This is all during the period at which we've known we've got this big problem of deforestation. The deforestation is a major cause of greenhouse gas emissions. It's shaping the weather patterns of the planet. We've known that since 2002 very, very well, and we've been trying to deal with it. And despite that, we have these changes. So that global tree cover during this 20-year or 17-year period has reduced by about 10%, so about 0.5% per year. Humid, so a particular type of forest, primary forest, so that's forest that's never been touched, or at least been a forest for, say, 100 years. Primary forest in the humid tropics, so these are places like Indonesia, the Congo Basin in Africa, the Amazon Basin in Latin America, in South America. The area of humid primary forest has decreased by 94%. We've lost almost all, compared to what we had in 2002, we've lost huge tracts of primary forest, a major source of greenhouse gas emissions itself. As I said, kind of about half of everything we associate with agriculture and land use. And we would say that some of that loss of trees and loss of forests is just about logging, and about 27% of it is actually all about changing the land use from one to another. So, and that's what we call deforestation. We saw one type is forest degradation. Forest degradation emits greenhouse gases, but deforestation emits more because you completely lose the trees and you don't plan to plant trees back on that. So a major cause of deforestation is associated with agriculture, and we'll get into that for this case of Brazil again next week. There's other land systems other than forests that are also affected by agriculture and a major kind of face changing our planet. So we look up in the upper left-hand corner, we've got an agriculture system, and this is from the UK, which is degrading the landscape. So this is a gully erosion in Devon County in the UK, and you can go all around the world and see these pretty severe gullies and other types of sheet erosion, which remove soil and channel around and degrade this landscape. In the lower left corner, we've got an example of rangeland degradation from Kenya in East Africa. So this might be associated with a few things. It might be associated with too heavy of grazing pressure. So the pasture is keeping too many animals. It's also is affected by kind of seasonal and year-to-year changes in rainfall, and things also like invasive species. So there's some invasive cactus, which is in kind of the middle of the screen there, which also degrades the landscape. In Alberta, the form that we're exposed a lot to is the loss of wetlands, as farmers often cultivate and drain wetlands for raising of crops, and that's done despite government laws that claim that all permanent wetlands are the property of the Crown. They're not the property of the individual farmer, though certainly we all know that what farmers do it has this negative effect. It's estimated that about 2/3 to 3/4 of all the wetlands in the farming area of Alberta have already been lost or converted, and those performed a variety of functions. Overall then, sorry, let me do the last slide, image here. This is a saline salinity problem in Australia. Australia, until the European settlement of Australia, had a kind of a particular ecosystem, had lots of vegetation, different types of trees which thrived in that environment. When farmers came and cleared the trees, the crops that they grew only draw water from the top of the soil. The trees that they replaced used to draw water from deeper in the soil. Because we don't have anything drawing water from deeper in the soil, the groundwater level is rising. And as groundwater level is rising, salt is rising with it and making these fields saline. So this is a massive and major concern in Australia, which we have a relatively shallow kind of topsoil. You've got this groundwater underneath, and therefore this problem on a massive scale. Overall, it's estimated then, looking at these different types of degradation processes, that about 3/4 of the world's land surface has had one form or another of substantial degradation of land. So we've had this major and serious impact on kind of 3/4 of the world's land surface. This is the estimate of the Intergovernmental Panel on Ecosystem Services and Biodiversity, which released its report last year. When they came up with this number, 75%, it replaced an earlier number of something like 30%. And so this is sort of a big wake-up call that there's sort of the reach of agriculture is much, much more dramatic and larger than we thought. And we can think about right here in Alberta, the loss of wetlands is an example of that. One more kind of area that was impacted by agriculture is biodiversity. And in the planetary boundaries, it talked about kind of biosystems, including kind of genetic diversity. What is biodiversity or biological diversity? I'm using this definition from The Guardian. I like The Guardian's coverage of the environment a lot. The variety of life on Earth in all of its forms and all of its interactions. So it's the living part of our planet in different manner. We often will think about 3 levels of biodiversity. So this is that at which we might be, that the term biodiversity might evoke for us. So we have to be more specific often about biodiversity. We might think about it as the genes. So for a particular species, for example, human species, we have different genes that we all have, and we can, send away our hair sample or saliva sample to 23andMe and learn more about our own genes and our genetic variations that we have. We can think about the differences between species, which is basically shown in this CNN collage of photos of species like black rhinos or white rhinos in Africa, or particular types of penguins. So these things often get people's attention. There's kind of how, say, the World Wildlife Fund kind of markets itself is about species diversity. But they will tell you that what's most important probably is actually using these iconic species to protect biodiversity at a bigger scale, which is the scales of ecosystems. So these are all of the stuff, all of the living stuff, all the living plants and animals and bacteria, which are interacting with each other and interacting with the physical environment. So we can think about what's the diversity of a particular ecosystem, and wetlands are an example here in Canada, wetland ecosystems. Agriculture is indicated also by this Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services to be the leading cause of biodiversity loss. There are some other causes like invasive species, but it's a leading cause of biodiversity loss. And they judge that the loss of species and habitat for those species poses as much a danger to life on Earth as does climate change. So this Intergovernmental Panel says we need to be dealing with climate change, absolutely, and we need to be doing it at the same time as thinking about all of the processes which are leading to loss of ecosystems and loss of biodiversity. Okay, so I'm going to close off that kind of visual part of the lecture, this mini lecture now. So I will somehow try to go back to, I'll stop sharing and stop recording, and then we'll go into the third mini lecture.